Day.
Pretty
But I
good.
had some
Glad to hear.
things removed.
Glad to
I
be here.
just went on to surgery because they kept itching.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all who are here on time. Thanks for coming and enjoying a beautiful fall day out there so far. Looks nice. Let's open in prayer. Lord, I thank you that we have this time this morning to have a class together and to look at the scriptures and understand what you say to us about the importance of love. And I pray that we will not only be hearers of this word, but doers also. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we have been looking at for a while in Sunday school a study of God's command to love God first, to love one another, to love our brothers, and then now we're looking at the phrase to love your neighbor. And last week we looked at that text in Luke chapter 10 where we get to learn who is our neighbor, and we didn't quite finish with that yet. So if you don't mind, let's go back to Luke chapter 10 and look at what the scriptures had to say here about the story of the parable that Jesus taught of a good Samaritan. And as I mentioned to you, in teaching this parable, Jesus used the extremes in the land of enemies. He used the religious leaders of the day who hated the Samaritans, and Samaritans who hated the Jews. And in this parable, he uses a person that is been hit by bandits. He's left half dead, stripped of his clothing, beaten, and they went away half dead. And then a priest, who is the leader of Israel when it comes to the sacrificial system. He was the one that stood between you and God, that brought your sacrifices that you made to God. He sees the man and he steps over to the other side of the road and walks past him. And I mentioned that we cannot get too hard on someone like that, because we can understand ourselves the fears that would come if you saw that situation. Sometimes people don't want to get involved because they're afraid that they couldn't help anyway. Sometimes people don't want to get involved because they're afraid of others around them that might hurt them too. And in this case, the fear of not getting involved was probably more because he was a Samaritan. It was racism. It was the hatred for them. And then a teacher of the law also. So you had the priest, and you had the teacher of the law, a Levite, come on the other side, and he did the same thing. He stepped to the other side, walked by. This is just a story. It wasn't a real event, just a story. He stepped by, walked by, did not do anything about it either, and because of his prejudice as well, obviously. But then Jesus used a Samaritan as the man that does something which was really strange for him to do for them. He says a Samaritan traveled, and now when he saw the man, what did he do? He took pity on him.
Put him on his donkey and
Put him on his donkey, took him to an inn, fed him,
killed him.
stayed there for a while to bandage him up, left the next day and gave him money for the innkeeper to take care of him in case he needed more expense to take care of it. He would come back in a week and check up on him. So he was really committed to helping the guy. And it all starts by when he saw him, he took pity on him. And having compassion. This is the same word we use for compassion. It's the same word that sometimes is translated mercy. Because he's acting as God by taking pity and mercy. And he takes care of the man. Now, I think this helps us with what we were talking about before when we talked about when you see your brother in need. And Bill helped us out with the question, well, what defines the need? And if we define need by the strictest of all definitions, where a person needs shelter and food and clothing, there's not many people that we're going to help, because many people have those things. But if we define need by taking pity upon the person and having compassion for them, to provide something for them that they could benefit from or be helped by, that would be a way of showing love to them, then the definition of need gets broader defined. And so then we're left to have to ask ourselves, well, who then defines this broader definition of need? And what do you think the answer is? I think, did you say God? God defines the definition of the need. The Holy Spirit will work on your heart to move upon you to say, here's something I'd like you to do. And it's interesting because you often don't hear God working on your heart about these things if you first don't, with your eyeballs, see pity. If you don't have compassion. And many people are helped in various levels of needs that they have because God moves on your heart with compassion and pity to reach out and to help them. And so loving others and meeting their needs goes beyond just taking care of, shelter and food and clothing so that they don't die from the elements or starve to death. It goes beyond that to having compassion for people who you see as in a needy situation. Now, obviously, this man was in a very needy situation because he was left half dead, right? So they take compassion on him, and then he, as Eric helped us to see, he puts him on his own donkey. He took care of him. He spent money. He used his own oil and wine and bandages to bandage the man's wounds. According to the parable, he takes him to an inn, took care of him there. The next day, he gives the innkeeper more money and says, look after him. And then he commits to even returning to see how he's doing later. So this was a full thing of what the man did as an enemy of an Israelite. And that's another thing we're going to see when we talk about loving your enemies. We can use this parable as an example because they were enemies. They weren't, taking up arms and killing one another type enemies, but they didn't like each other. They hated one another. And Jesus uses this story to say, well, who's your neighbor? It's the person who has a need, who could be helped. And verse 37, the expert in law replied, the one who had mercy on him was the neighbor. So, see, it wasn't even the help he gave him first. It was what? It was the attitude and the understanding of to have compassion and to have mercy for the person, kind of a thing. Okay? Questions on that? All right. So I wanted to bring that up. So the neighbor is anybody that God shows you to have compassion for and to take pity for, who may have a need that God puts on your heart that you can help them. Okay? Any comments or further helping we need to do to define that or help that more? And I like the fact of having it said that it's someone that God puts on your heart. There may be different levels of God doing that, where he may put on your heart the need of all the people that were in Florida, in the Gulf of Florida with this last hurricane. It's not an individual person. You see the thing on TV, you see the situation, and God puts in your heart that you want to help them. And so how can you help them? Well, you may not have an address, and they may not have mail being delivered. So you can help in general by supporting organizations and missions that run to the aid of people like this, that go to that. And there are different groups that do that, and you can give money to help that way. You might be moved by God to want to further help in a more specific way, and maybe you know of, or you're going to research out a church down in that area that would have members of the church that were, devastated by the hurricane, And by contacting them through electronic media or whatever, you might find there's some specific things you could do to send funds to help, or maybe put together a work crew yourself and later travel down and go to that church and help people through that. See, it's whatever God puts on your heart to do, and it can be all the way from just writing a check to getting in your car and taking a week's vacation and going down. But it's the Lord that puts this on your heart.
Amen.
It's God that gives you the desire to do these things or the show. But it first starts with having compassion. If we watch the news and we see catastrophes like that, and we're not moved with any compassion, I think something's wrong with us. You know, I don't think we're being human at all, or especially not Christian with it. But to be moved with compassion. Now, sometimes you're moved with compassion, and the compassion is to pray. It's just to remember to pray for them all the time. It may not be to send money or even get in the car and go down. It may be that you're just going to commit to praying for these people. And every time God wakes you up in the middle of the night, He wants you to pray for these people again. And so you're committed to pray. Do you kind of understand what we're saying about how this love can be demonstrated through needs and showing compassion?
Oh, yeah.
You picked the perfect week to preach that because of what we had in our bulletin last week. All month long, there's things that we can do, all month long.
Yeah, we're all month long, every week we have something we can do to help a mission,
Yeah.
to help some ministry.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on it, or further, do we need to balance it more with other things? Pam?
I just have a comment about even talking to someone can help. Like yesterday, I was in a situation, and this person I'm having compassion with. There's another person that came to this particular event that was happening, and I saw such an improvement in this person. And I said a few things, and we talked and things. Well, I'm telling you, that person told the one I was having compassion on how much it meant. So even if you can verbally even say sometimes some things.
Sure,
You know,
sure.
it doesn't have to be
Yeah, that's sure.
that.
But
doesn't
it's
have to
having
be a
your
lot
heart
for-
moved.
Yes.
Having your heart moved to
Yes.
care about the others. This is where it starts there. So our neighbor is, who then becomes our neighbor?
Everybody that God puts in
Who
your heart.
needs has a need.
and has a need.
It's anybody with a need
Mhm.
that we have been moved by God to have compassion on, to take pity on. The stories are so familiar because they work so well, but it's the starfish on the beach
Yes,
all over again.
yes, tell us one.
Where after the storm, and you can't pick up every starfish on the beach and throw it back in the water, but you can pick up the one in front of you and toss it back in the water. And we can't feed the whole world, clothe the whole world, give medical attention to the whole. We can't provide everything for the whole world, but maybe seeing that around the world there are these needs may open your eyes to your next door neighbor, or somebody in your family, or somebody in your town, or to something. It's being moved with compassion to help others, and that's where it really starts. You move with compassion. Okay? All right, let's keep moving with this then. Let's go to Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, we have some more said about loving others. Remember, we have been talking about loving God and loving one another, which is fellow believers, and then loving your neighbor, which is anybody, as we see, who has a need that God draws you to have compassion on. And we're eventually going to get to loving your enemy, which is the hardest of all them to comprehend and to do. So in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, it says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. So he's taking a physical debt of money, and he's saying the only way you should be in debt is not monetarily, it's in your love for one another. Except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. That was taken from what Jesus said when asked what was the greatest commandment in the Old Covenant law. And what was the greatest commandment, he said? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That upon these two commands hang the whole law of the Scriptures. So he says, when you love one another. So what's the implication of verse 8 then about that?
You have to love others when they don't even acknowledge you or love you back, or...
Well, that may be, but I'm looking specifically in relationship to the debt part of it.
You continue to love. There's no,
What's
you can't
the...
fill it.
You fulfill the law.
You can't, you can never pay it off.
Right.
It's not a debt that you can pay off and be done with. So no one's ever excused because let's say you spent 40 years of your life helping others and loving them this way, and now you're saying, well, I can take a break. I don't have to care anymore. I'm done. I don't have to do this anymore. Well, that's not so. When it comes to love, we are in debt always. Now, why do you think that is?
Because he always loves us.
Because he always loves us. We're debt. God's love is always for us, and we have this debt to love one, to love
it's
others.
the debt that we owe him for all the love he gave us by dying on the
Could
cross.
never pay it back, could we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's likened to a let. The commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. So it's amazing that the other commands that even don't relate physically to this are fulfilled in this. So I've always said, not always, since I've been, I'll say for the last 45 years, I have said that my hardest part is not what I don't understand in the Bible. It's not trying to figure out things that are still mysteries to me. My hardest part is doing what I do understand.
Yeah.
And what God tells us so simply in the Bible is exhaustive. You know, how do you ever stop loving? And how do you ever get to the point where you now have a handle on it where you can say, I got it? No, it's the thing that God says is the most important. And this is why the older I get, and I do get older, that all of us do every day, we get another day older, and I look at ministry and I think of ministry, and I'm always constantly trying to reevaluate the ministry here and look at ministry, what's happening in our culture, things and around the world and culture. What are we emphasizing, and what are we doing? And so many times I feel that the church is tempted to get away from this which is most important: loving God, loving others, loving one another, loving your neighbor, you know, loving your enemies, all these love commands, and majoring on minors. Because really everything else is a minor. This is a major. Later we're going to look at Matthew 25. You can't get away from it. When you show love to others, you are doing it unto me, Jesus says. You are fulfilling what the law is all about. And Christian love that becomes manifest day in and day out in your relationship to other people, regardless of who they are, is how we really show the world that we are Christians. Remember the command that was given in John 13, 34, and 35? You are to love one another just as I loved you. Remember? And then by this, what did he say? All people will know that you're my disciples.
Yes.
When you have love one for another. So, you may get tired of that record playing, but that's the number one hit. That's where it's at, and that's what God says we must do this first. Now, as you do this, yes, you then can do other things. Other things are important, but you can't neglect this first. So, it's like that. Okay, let's go to Galatians chapter 5. I don't know why I have Romans 15, 1 and 2, because that's really not applicable there, but so just ignore that. Galatians, it talks about ministry and love and all, but not love itself in particular. Galatians 5, 13 and 14. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. In Christ, we have freedoms. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, your sinful natures. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Now, I love, and we're later going to look at this passage, I love Philippians 2 for this, to talk about humility. To follow the example of Christ's humility, where we're not to just think of our own interest, but the interest of others as well. He doesn't say only think of the interest of others. He says not only your own interest, but also the interest of others. And then the threefold humility of Jesus as the example. But so use your freedom to indulge your flesh, but rather serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is filled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. But, again, now this is New Covenant talking about the fulfillment of the Old Covenant command. The entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. It's pretty plain. It doesn't
beat around the bush.
It doesn't leave room for a lot of other things to come in. He says this is what we should be about every day, trying to grow in our love for God, and our love for one another, our love for our neighbor, even our love for our enemy. That as we demonstrate this, people around us are going to know that we're Jesus' disciple as we do so, and we fulfill the command of God. Pretty impressive stuff there.
Pastor, what does that mean? Do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh.
God has set you free. You have a new nature now. But don't use that freedom to now go back and indulge in the sinful stuff.
Okay.
Use it now to follow God. Okay. Before God saved you, you couldn't follow God. You only were trapped by your sinful stuff. Okay?
Yeah.
Good question. So let's look at some more related verses about this. Let's go to the one I just mentioned, Philippians chapter 2. It's to the right. Ephesians, Philippians, and then Colossians. In Philippians chapter 2, this is one of my favorite passages of Christian walk. And it starts by using the rhetorical question, which has an answer each time. Yes, I do. Of course I do. And look at what it says beginning in verse 1. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, do you have encouragement from being united with Christ? And the answer is, of course I do. If any comfort from his love, absolutely I do, right? Yes. If any common sharing in the Spirit, yes, I get to have the Holy Spirit and he ministers in my life. If any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded. Like-minded with one another? No. Like-minded with Jesus. Being like Jesus in your thinking, okay? Be like-minded, having the same love as God does for us, with encouraging, comfort, the things he just mentioned. Have the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind with God, not necessarily each other, although that's commanded later, but of God. And then here's how the rubber meets the road with this text. Here's how you put this great theology into practice, the great teaching into practice, the ideal. This is what the ideal looks like. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather, and this is important, it all comes together, rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. That's all one sentence. That's not supposed to be broken up so that you don't get it all together.
Boy, if we all lived that way, it would be wonderful.
It'd be amazing. I mean, I want to bring it down to the small. This is what manners are all about. You know, when you eat at a table with other people, why do you close your mouth while you chew? Is it that the food tastes better? No. Why do you do it?
The others.
For the others, so they don't have to watch you chewing, and the food slopping around in your mouth. And here, you know. Grew up working on farms. I know what cows and horses sound like. You know, well, you sound like I used to tell my kids, you sound like a cow. You know, the way you eat, like. And we have a tendency that the crunchier the food, the more we want to make noise. By the celery, it's hard to do it this way. Well, why do manners say chew with your mouth shut? Why? Because you're being considerate not of yourself, but what? Of others around you. That you're paying attention to other people around you. A selfish person doesn't care about others around you. We always have more than 2 people at our table eating all the time. I don't know how this happens, but we always have more than 2. And when you have more than 2, the Loveland house rule is take what's in front of you and pass it clockwise. Pass it to the left. Okay? Now, why is that? Because if all you do is take what's in front of you and you leave it there, nobody else gets it. Right? And if they're passing it to you, it all piles up in front of you. And you got it all. So you take what's in front of you, put some on your plate, or say no thanks and pass it to the next person. Passing it around is just manners because you're being considerate of whom? Other people. It's something as silly as that. But it's something as silly as that we get to understand what the problem is. Selfish ambition. It's all about me. And it's not godly to have things all about you. Godliness is not only your own interest. Yes, you can take some corn and put it on your plate, but pass it to the next person too. Don't think only of your own interest, but also the interest of others. And here's another. I use manners like this because it's an everyday situation. Let's say you have a plate this big, piled high. So as you pass that, you can take more than one piece, because as you look around real quickly and you say, okay, there's 20 people here, and there's enough servings here that all 20 people can have a couple pieces. No problem, I'll take 2 pieces. But if you got a plate this big, and it's something special or different, and there's only a little bit of it, and you got 20 people, you can't take half of it and scrape it up on your plate itself, right? Because if you do, what happens? Everybody else gets shortchanged, and somebody's not going to get anything. Now, I'm using a very simple illustration, but it really helps us to see a very complex and profound truth, which is, don't think of your own interest only, but also the interest of others. This is why manners are manners. This is why this is what helps people get along with things. Is that, you know, I used to make jokes sometimes with the kids, especially the younger kids, when they have something that we're having something they really like, and I say to them, this is not the Grand China buffet. there's not an endless amount of food back in the kitchen ready to come out. This is it. So you got to think about other people too here. You know, don't think that, you know, when you go to the Grand China Buffet, when you finish, you know, you take. Have you ever seen what people do with the lobster? Not lobster, the crab calls.
Yeah.
They stand there like this, waiting for the person to come. As the person comes, the first person in line, until they can't. You know, there's a few left. So like the first 2 people get some, then they got to wait for the next batch to come out. But there's always a batch coming out. But food and lines are great definers of human nature. If you got to wait in a line for something, what you do, how you handle. I mean, these are all just great examples of what your heart is like. And so when God says, think not only of your own interest, but also the interest of others, how's your dear wife? Stopped?
Yeah.
Great. His wife had a very bad nosebleed this morning. He had to go back. Glad she's doing better. Marissa, right? Larissa. I was close.
That's good.
I had an M instead of an L.
That's good for
There you
you.
go. I had the Rissa part though.
Amongst friends, who cares?
Who cares, right? So we're on Philippians 2, Dave, in verse 3. Verses 3 through 4 are one thought. So do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Now, you know, this goes against so much of what our world teaches us.
Oh, yeah.
That it's so opposite. And, you know, we think it's cool and cute when kids go, oh, I'm number one, you know, they're little kids running around, hey, I beat you in a little game. Well, you got to watch it, because if you let that attitude just keep developing, it becomes so self-centered and selfish, they'll have a hard time dealing with other people and handling defeat. Handling, you know, being able to recognize the difference between something that really matters and something that's just a game meant for entertainment. It's just a game. And when you understand the difference between those, you help them become more mature in their aspect and their outlook on life in general. So I'm still learning these lessons. As selfish ambition, vain conceit, rather in humility, humble yourself, value others above yourself. Does that say that they are better than you?
No.
What does it say?
It's saying, Pastor, you should, when it says value them, it's saying you should put them first.
Sorta, yeah.
And you should put their values and morals first.
No, not quite, Ruth. A little bit further on that. Let's look back at this. What it's saying is that you value them doesn't mean they actually are more intelligent than you or greater than you. Let me use an area.
I think I got it.
Kind of like appreciate what they bring to the table. They may not be better than you, but they may have an aspect that you may laugh that you can actually learn from.
Okay, good. You're all on the issue, but I'm pulling teeth today. Let me give you an example. There are people who will not listen to another person if that person isn't as educated as they are. You understand? Or if they're not as rich as they are, or not as strong as they are, or not as good athlete as they are, or other things like this. They have a hard time submitting to someone and caring about someone who's not as good as they. However, I've often said that it's amazing how intelligent people will submit to inanimate things. For example, when you come up to a traffic light and it turns red, you better stop. Regardless of your IQ, you better stop. If there's traffic coming the other way, you better stop, right? If a policeman is out there and he's directing traffic because there's been an accident, you better pay attention or you're going to get a ticket or worse, right? It has nothing to do with a person's education level or financial value or anything, right? It's the fact that you are willing to say, I'm going to submit to that because it's beneficial to me to submit to that, and it's beneficial to others that I submit to that. It's beneficial that I stop at a red light, right? It's beneficial to me so I don't get in an accident. It's beneficial for others so that they don't get in an accident with me, right? Well, that's how you consider someone above yourself. It's not that they have to be. By human nature, we tend to relate to people or not relate to people based upon social or cultural standings or eliteness. It's very, very easy to snub others. James talks about as someone comes into your assembly and they're not well dressed and you make them sit back there, but somebody comes in well dressed, you say, here, take a seat up here, because you're being a respecter of persons. You're caring about that. And human nature many times only cares about those that are like them or better. It's amazing how in human nature we always are looking to climb the social ladder up. We're not interested in climbing it down to help those down there. That's the sinful nature of man, that we don't consider others equal to ourselves. That's what prejudice comes from. That's what racism comes from, where you make decisions in your own mind that that person isn't as valuable as you, or they don't matter as much as you, or you don't care about them as much as you. If you see somebody dressed in something different than you would wear, you might snub that person because you're looking at them from your own values and perspective. And if their clothing isn't something that costs a lot, you look at them as being inferior. Now, you wouldn't say those words yourself, but by your actions you do. So when he says but in humility, value others above yourself, in order for you who may be more successful to value someone less successful, it takes humility on your part. What do you need to do to be humble in that? What do you need to do? What do you need to do about in your own attitude, your mind, in order to do that, Ruth?
I think you have to have the right mindset and the right attitude to be able to do that, Pastor.
Yep. And so how do you humble yourself?
You just put your ego aside.
Right, Eric. You put your own interest and your own ego aside and you say, I get to care about the interest of others. You with me?
Yes.
That's not an easy thing to do. When you see, we do it all the time with people by the way they're dressed and how they look. And yet, if you found out that this person was actually a billionaire and they dress shabby, what would you then do to the person?
Oh, accept them.
Well, you'd accept them, you'd be in their back pocket, wouldn't you?
No.
Hoping a little bit falls out. But it's humility. It's not thinking only of your own interest, but also the interest of others. That's what the Good Samaritan did in the parable.
Yeah.
That's not what the other examples did in the parable. This passage is one of my favorites for preaching to me about these things. It was to a passage like this that God got me involved in jail ministry, which eventually led to prison ministry. I started doing jail ministry down in Salem County after I got saved a few years later. And God humbled me and showed me that these people have real needs. And my friends on my stratus weren't interested in what I had to say about Jesus. But here were some people that were interested in hearing what I had to say about Jesus. And all I needed to do was humble myself and realize that the soul of this man is just as valuable as the soul of this man. And in fact, if God were to save this man in jail, that might change a lot of people's lives because of his change. You understand? You see? And you can't do those kinds of things. You can't go in a nursing home week in and week out and minister in a nursing home without being humble. You can't work with special children without being humble. You can't work with inmates without being humble, because your own attitudes of your heart will prevent you from caring about others and considering their needs as well.
That's why it takes a special breed of person to work in certain fields like that. You know, some people can, some people can't.
Some people can, some people can't, and sometimes the can, the can't is based upon whether they'll humble themselves or not. And for certain things, people will say, I'm not going to humble myself. And also depends upon God's calling of you too. Bill?
I think for me, the biggest thing in that relationship is not always my attitude, but it's how the other person reacts. You know, it sounds simple to say I'm going to be humble, and then if you don't get a positive response from that person you're being humble to, then the humbleness kind of wears off a little.
It's hard to be humble.
Yeah.
I had to quickly evaluate that for myself. I was on the 4th tier of the Trenton State Prison and passing out Christmas cards when a man threw a glass full of urine and a plate full of other stuff through the bars at me.
See?
Wow. And you went back the next time. You went back to do it the next time.
I went back, a little smarter though, but I went back.
Ducked.
I told the chap, I'm not passing out Christmas cards anymore. But yeah, it is hard. But that's when humility has to kick in even more. It is hard. It's hard to feed the hand that bites you. And it's hard to not go back and want to feed another hand because one hand bit you. You know, how many times are you going to get conned when you try to help others? But if God wants you to do it, you've got to be willing to be conned for God's benefit, for God's sake. You know, I'm happy to let you con me if I know you're conning me, if God tells me to do it. I don't like to not know you're conning me and then find out I got conned. You know? I'd rather know it. but
That really takes a lot of humility.
yeah, it's hard to do that. But that's, you see, and I bring that up because it's a personal illustration. I bring it up, but I also bring it up to say what the other guys in the prison that saw that thought of me because of that. We didn't think you were coming back.
Yeah.
We didn't think we'd see you this week. Why not? Well, and you know, it really helps to show them the difference that God makes. And humility is one of those things that is a powerful tool we have in our arsenal, and yet we use it so little because our natural hearts, our natural natures are pride driven. It's about me and me only, and it's me first, not you. I mean, I'm going to use something even silly because in grammar, you know, I don't know what they're doing in school today, but in grammar, you know, when you said something, it was always Alice and I, or Alice and me, depending upon whether I'm the subject or the object. But Alice and me want to wish you a Merry Christmas. Okay. But today it is always me and Alice. Me is always first. And that's a small point, but it goes along with the everything's about me. It's all about me. And rarely do you find anybody that will say it properly where they don't put themselves first, they put the other person first. It's always me. It's always me. And it's an attitude of our lives, and it's not a good one, because life is tough when it's always about you, because guess what? Others don't think about you as much as you think about you. And others don't care about you as much as you care about you. And you got a rude awakening that's going to smack you when you come to realize that others aren't caring about you. They're not thinking about you. They don't give a rip about you. But you've been living your whole life as you're the center of the universe.
You have meitis.
Meitis.
I just recognized something when you said that, because I'm sitting in a kindergarten class, and that's kind of...
So it's all about me.
It's all about me, but you know what? This teacher is amazing. She said, you know, you're poking so-and-so, and he's trying to learn, so you're interfering with him. So you let him learn, and you listen to me also. You know, it's just...
But I bet you they say me and Bob.
I don't think so.
I bet you they do. I haven't heard a kid in a long, long time say the other person's name first and me. It's always me and the other person.
Yeah.
And it's just part of our culture today.
Yeah.
I want
It's,
a snack.
huh?
I want a nap. I want this.
Yeah, but if it's you know, me and John are going to go play, or you know, it's always me first, and it's not grammatically correct.
Not only that, Pastor, but having a name before me actually sounds better to me too.
Yep. That's good, but it shows humility when you address the other person first and you put yourself second. But that's just a small thing. I mean, don't leave church today thinking that, you know, Pastor talked about grammar with me first. You know, and
Well, no, it lets us know that others are first.
yeah,
Yes. Hey.
the rules of grammar and the rules of manners are biblical. They follow this concept of humility. But anyway, so that's a great passage. I'd love to spend more time, but we're not. Thank you for your attention today. Go have some coffee, and if you talk to one another, mention the other person's name first.
Sandy! Walter! Good morning!